and there's vacancies. So at first, as the economy starts to recover, vacancies fall. And then when vacancies are low, then you have an increase in rent as demand goes up because the supply of land is fixed, right? As we have a greater demand, the rent has nowhere to go but up. So the rent will rise and the land values rise. And then real estate speculators notice the increase in real estate prices. So they jump in order to profit from an increase in the price because of leverage, right? If you put down 10, 20% and the real estate prices goes up a bit, you make a huge return on your down payment. So, uh, meanwhile, interest rates that were low in the depressed economy start to go up, both because the Federal Reserve uh, reduces the growth of the money supply and targets a higher interest rate, and because of the greater demand to borrow. So interest rates go up. So at the peak of the cycle, what we have is high interest rates and high prices for real estate, which make it no longer profitable for business and no longer affordable for households. So they stop buying, real estate prices stop rising, and then you see the recession. And since much of financial lending is for real estate, as real estate falls and people don't pay their mortgages, uh, the financial system goes crashing down with it. And that's what we saw in 2008 and 9. Okay. So, any questions so far about the business cycle? All right, so I mentioned before the works of Mason Gaffney on the real estate cycle and on Homer Hoyt, the real estate economist who wrote the book 100 Years of Land Value in Chicago, who discovered the 18-year real estate cycle. Now, there was another writer that I'm going to talk about today first, and that was Sakolsky. So he wrote a book in 1932 that was called The Great American Land Bubble. So he wrote about real estate speculation historically, uh, especially in the 1800s. So he subtitled it The Amazing Story of Land Grabbing, Speculations and Booms from Colonial Days to the Present Time. He was an assistant professor of finance in the College of the City of New York. Now let me go to share screen, and I will then, where is it? Share screen here and here and share. So you should now be able to should be able to see the slide that says the Great American Land Bubble. You see that? Y'all see that?
Yes.
Nobody said no.
Yes.
All right. So good. All right. So it's the story of land grabbing, speculations, and booms from colonial days to the present time. And he says land speculation in the United States has been a national business. So from the very beginning, the history of the United States has been one of land speculation. But he says, yet no history of it has hitherto been written up to his day in the 1930s, and small wonder, speculation has been looked upon as a dubious business. It therefore has been conducted largely in secret and without enduring records. Arduous research is required by those who delve into its intricate dealings, and that's what he did in this book. So he goes back to the very beginning of Europeans landing in America. So the Europeans colonizing and exploring America was itself a speculation. It was a speculation to Columbus. After all, nobody was sure what the outcome would be. Would they get great wealth, or would it all just be a costly endeavor. So it was considered a speculation by the kings of Spain, France, and England. They looked at the Americas as a source of riches in gold, silver, pelts, and later crops like tobacco and sugar. It was from the land that these precious goods were produced, and the ownership of the land was as essential to them as the political jurisdiction over it. So royal favors were accordingly given vast territories, and land was distributed to individuals and companies as royal rewards. So the colonial charters granted in England to individuals and companies gave proprietorship of the soil, but the king reserved political jurisdiction and control as well as mineral rights. So therefore, early uh, settlers and explorers and colonial chiefs like Penn, Calvert, and Oglethorpe received grants of land, and they had the governing rights, but they were revocable at royal will. And as the colonies became more densely settled and advanced in political status, the king appointed governors to rule over the colonies. So one of the colonies was New Amsterdam, settled by the Dutch and then conquered by the British. When the proprietary right to the soil had been given, the possessors of these rights or their assigns continued to hold the land originally allotted to them. So James, Duke of York, to whom his affectionate brother has presented the whole Dutch province of New Amsterdam, and more besides, began to sell or otherwise dispose of his vast domain. So he granted to Lords Carteret and Berkeley most of the province of New Jersey. These sold out to two companies, the proprietors of East Jersey and the proprietors of West Jersey, respectively. Companies which continued in existence throughout the 18th century, although they lost their feudal rights in 1702. So the conveyance of allegedly unoccupied lands, of course occupied by American Indians, but the Europeans treated them as unoccupied. So to private individuals or companies, which these companies undertook the management, settlement, and resale, was a common practice in colonial times. So much of the early English settlement of America was conducted on this plan. The London and Plymouth companies were ostensibly trading companies, but the motive was land speculation, although not openly expressed. But that was an important factor in the settlement of the colonies. So as the population began to fill up the accessible regions with colonial charter grants, the acquisition of large unsettled tracts for pecuniary gain became more and more into vogue. So Maine is the state in the Northeast in New England. During the first 100 years of North American colonization, economic conditions gave little encouragement to private land schemes. Land was too plentiful. But a few such enterprises were undertaken. As early as 1661, the colony of Massachusetts sold to a few individuals for £400 a large tract on the Kennebec River in Maine, the Kennebec Purchase. So Maine at first was part of Massachusetts, but later broke off and became its own state. The heirs held it for nearly a century without doing anything with it. In 1753, they incorporated and proceeded to dispose of their holdings. And that corporation existed until 1816. Another main land deal was the Penobscot Company. None held out promise of profit to the proprietors until about a quarter century before the Revolution. About this time, wealth had accumulated in the colonies. Free land had ceased. Cities and channels of trade were established, and the population gradually pushed forward to the Allegheny footholds. They were moving to the west of the Appalachians. So vast, allegedly unoccupied tracts beyond that became a lure. Few dared to settle in the region. Actually, actual ownership was held by the Indians and claimed by the French. And that was not just Quebec, but down into the upper Midwest. This was not a discouragement. Uh, they thought, well, wasn't the territories in the East occupied once by the Indians, and was it not bought from them for mere trifles like Manhattan was? Why not then establish similar colonies in the West and start anew, building up land values? To the descendants of the pioneer colonials, the backwoods Indians and hostile Frenchmen presented no serious obstacles. Then, meanwhile, in the South, there were large estates, uh, and proprietorship in estates was highly regarded. It was an emblem of nobility and status. So, land ownership, the ownership of land in large estates, carried with it political as well as pecuniary preferment. This was particularly characteristic of the South. So, during colonial days, the presence of large landed estates engrossed in a few hands fostered a landed aristocracy. Land ownership, therefore, was desirable for social and political as well as pecuniary or financial reasons. So that was so in Virginia. The Virginian was not so much of a gentleman unless he lived in the midst of countless acres. If he was a non resident owner or a large patentee of the crown, he employed land agents on the spot to look after his estates or sell or lease his holdings. So grants of land in the southern colonies were a source of continual political intrigues. Land grabbing in the South began even before the importance of slaves or tobacco. Now, the areas east of the Allegheny Mountains were gradually engrossed, and as towns and plantations spread out to the Piedmont sections, covetous eyes were pointed towards the vast, unsettled, allegedly, domain to the westward. The political sovereignty and administrative control of the territory were in doubt. Various colonies claimed a share of the westward area as part of their original charter grants. For example, Virginia claimed land all the way to the Pacific. If they took the north and south boundaries of Virginia and extended that westward, they claimed the land all the way to the Pacific. And the charter limits were not fixed so that conflicting claims overlapped. So George Washington was a good example of a landowner in colonial days. So there were disputes regarding ownership and the right of control of the soil. Intercolonial jealousy and greed led the rival claimants to take measures, secretly and openly, to assert their rights by actual occupation or royal conveyances. So George Washington and his half brothers were involved with the Ohio Company. Washington, early in his political career, uh, was brought into contact with land grabbing. Of course, Washington was both in the army fighting against the French, and also he was a surveyor by profession, so that got him in contact with Western lands. All right, so the French and Indian War, which took place in North America as well as in Europe. In Europe, I think they called it the 7 Years' War. Anyway, the French and Indian War, because the British fought against Indians and the French. Uh, so it interrupted while Washington's land schemes were interrupted. But following the peace treaty of 1763, Washington entered wholeheartedly into Western land acquisitions. Virginia had set aside a large section of territory west of the Alleghenies as bounties for its soldiers in the war, and Washington set about to secure the claims of the veterans. So while thus garnering the means of acquiring lands, Washington secretly employed an agent, his friend Crawford, to seek out and preempt the best locations for himself. He even entered into a plan of colonization and thought of importing Germans as settlers. But a major change in the law happened in 1763. A royal proclamation arrived from London forbidding the colonial governors from granting patents for land beyond the sources of any rivers which flow into the Atlantic from the west and the northwest. So Great Britain, in the proclamation of 1763, prohibited the colonials from going across the Appalachians into the western lands. But Washington scornfully treated that as a scrap of paper in writing to his friend and agent, Crawford, who had taken up residence uh, in the back country. The future father of his country set forth definitely his speculation aims. So, meanwhile, the author goes into California, where I live and where Henry George lived. So he describes California's golden land gambles. So in all the new states of the Union, land monopolization has gone on at an alarming rate. Thus wrote Henry George. In 1871, he wrote his first book, Our Land and Land Policy, and this was before Progress and Poverty, which was published in 1879. So George's first book was on land policy and land ownership in the United States. Uh, so in none of the states, said George, has land monopolization grown so fast as in California. And in none of them, perhaps, are the evil effects so manifest. So Henry George, a native of Philadelphia, spent the golden years of his life uh, in California. He lived in San Francisco, and here he noted the growth of land values in the progress of time. Here, George witnessed the land grabbing dating back to the Spanish period, and here he saw the bad effects of excessive speculation. So, as known as the advocate and examiner of the single tax on land value, George undoubtedly absorbed his economic philosophy from the landed property situation in the Golden State. So, California occupies an exceptional situation as an episode in American land speculation, and that was due to the gold rush. At the time of its occupation by American forces, that was in the 1840s, the country was still suffering from the effects of the speculative debauches culminating in the Panic of 1837. I previously discussed the canal building of the early 1800s. The first canal was the Erie Canal in New York State, and that was so successful in promoting commerce that other canals followed. And of course, where the government was building canals, the land would rise in value. So you had a lot of land speculation, and that used money from the Western banks, which were not capitalized with gold and silver. They had their banknotes that they couldn't redeem in gold and silver. So there was a big panic in 1837, followed by a great depression in the United States into the 1940s. Then the economy recovered, and you had another depression in the 1850s. In fact, every 18 years there was a depression, 1850s, 1870s, 1890s. So just when California became a new American territory, the gold rush almost obliterated all other gainful endeavors. People dropped what they were doing and headed to the hills where they could mine for gold. So gold was discovered in California in 1848. Reports of it reached the Atlantic states a short time thereafter, and then the rest of the world. So the rush of 49ers, those who were coming to California in 1849, then took place. Land grants, land titles, or patents were not required, or if they were ignored. The ruling passion was to dig out the yellow metal. Squatter sovereignty, under the national preemption laws, had already gained much headway in the frontier regions and was merely transferred to Cali- California. So, who owned the soil from which the gold was sifted or dug mattered little. So, the fortune seekers of all classes were there for it, and they insisted on their right to take it. So, in terms of economics, the margin of production before 1848 had been on agricultural land in California, where the population was expanding into the Central Valley and other areas to grow crops. And with that margin of production, the wage level of the economy was what you could get at the margin, so that was a modest amount of income. But then with the discovery of the gold rush, the margin of production shifted to the Sierras where the gold was. So you could rush over to the Sierras and mine gold, and what you could earn for a day was a multiple of what you could earn in a farm. So therefore, what do you think happened in the rest of California? Wages went up. This was an excellent illustration of the margin of production, where the wage is set at the margin. Now the margin was gold mining, yielding a high wage. So what were workers then paid in San Francisco? Before, they were a worker in San Francisco who's an employee would earn about what you could earn in farming, because you could shift from farming to the city or back. Now with the gold rush, the margin of production generated a high wage. So wages in San Francisco rose proportionally. All wages were lifted up. So anyone moving into California during the first 2 decades after the gold rush with the object of acquiring wealth through the purchase and selling lands would have been regarded as insane. Yet, the landowners did earn fortunes. More fortunes were made in California lands and real estate than in gold mining. And land grabbing became as prevalent in the Golden State as in the other new territories of the federal union. The old Spanish grants, which had been a disturbing political factor and a serious legal problem in the Louisiana territory, became here also a source of speculation and fraud. What happened was, like in the Bay Area of California, San Francisco and Oakland, San Jose, that area, you had large Mexican ranches inherited from Spanish days. And the treaty with Mexico uh, promised to respect those land titles, but a lot of those land titles were grabbed by the Anglo-Americans through fraud, since the Mexicans didn't really understand the American legal system and also didn't have as fluency in the English language. So the period was characterized by the same sorts of fraud, villainy, and corruption as happened in the other states. The author says even if gold had not been discovered in California just after the American conquest, real estate and land speculation would have flourished in the territory. And San Francisco was a scene of town lot manipulation as early as 1847. General Kearny, an American military commander of California, issued in 1847 a proclamation granting to the municipality of San Francisco the right and title of the government of the United States and of the new territory to the beach and water lots in the eastern part of town. So within a week thereafter, this property was ordered to be sold, and the proceeds were used by the town authorities. In that year also, an important section of the town was laid out into streets by the public authorities, and the vacant land was converted into town lots. A public sale of these lots took place. Speculators and investors bought land, 450 lots at $12 per lot. Each purchaser was required to fence the lot and erect a building within a year. The chief source of income of the city authorities were the receipts from the sales of these public lots. Now, of course, they could have rented out that land and then had a continuous source of income, But instead of doing that, they sold the land, and that's what happened in other states also. So corruption prevailed, and it's reported that the choice sites were secured by speculators or by private agreements with the city officials. So the city officials who were corrupt profited from the sale of these lands a lot more than they would have benefited from renting out those lands. So the next year in 1848, another great public sale of town lots took place. Values had advanced, but owing to the best selections having already been engrossed, prices were disappointing. So the price of lots ranged from $60 to $50, averaging 22.50. So then, at this time, San Francisco was buzzing with the excitement of the gold discovery. A boom was on. The best locations had been snapped up by astute buyers, and they were demanding high prices on resale. Meanwhile, immigration was rapidly adding to the population. So squatting became a general nuisance, both in the city and outlying districts. The squatters organized themselves into associations and resisted efforts to oust them. But squatting was a popular method of acquiring real estate even in the Spanish days. And with preemption, the byword for the settlers in the United States public domain, the newcomers from the states set up their tents or cabins wherever they found a suitable vacant plot and defied those who claimed title to the property to dispossess them. But with the city lots in San Francisco, that continued and the speculation became intensified. Members of the city council, the ayuntamiento, and other political favorites largely figured as buyers. So Herd House, mayor, protested that the best city lots were being taken by the speculators and politicians at ridiculously low prices. On his recommendation, the governor of the territory intervened and ordered sales to stop. But the mayor merely passed a formal resolution uh, protesting that the governor had no legal right to interfere with the sale of the city property and announced another sale of desirable water lots in March 1850. Now, 1850 is when California became a state. San Francisco was the landing place of thousands of fortune seekers. It was the chief emporium for an immense backcountry where real money was being sifted from the soil by the increasing hordes of prospectors. As a contemporary analyst noted, in 2 years' space, the financier doubled his capital without risk to himself, and accumulation went on in geometric progression. It was chiefly the holders of real estate that made the greatest fortunes. The possession of a small piece of building ground in and about the center of business was a fortune in itself. So those lucky people who held lots from times before the discovery of gold, or who shortly managed afterwards to secure these plots, they were suddenly enriched beyond their most sanguine homes. That kind of is good evidence for the general concept that land values and rent absorbs the gains of economic progress. The enormous rents paid for the use of ground and temporary buildings in 1849 made all men covetous of real estate. By far, the greater part had originally belonged to the city, formerly called the Pueblo when it was Mexican, or the village of Yerba Buena, but the guardians of its interests from conquest downwards liberally helped themselves and their friends to the choice lots. So every boom is followed by a bust. The retribution for this real estate mania induced by the inflation of the gold rush was soon to come. Uh, Hardly had the lot sale of 1853 ended when real estate values collapsed. So that was the depression of the 1850s, following the real estate cycle, right, where the last collapse had been 1837. So the in the depression of the 1850s, the market was glutted. right? Demand was down. The offerings of real estate purchases glutted the market, uh, and they were in debt, so they needed cash to complete their payments. So the bottom fell out. The contemporary analyst thus describes the situation in 1854. Um, so, uh, looking disinterestedly at the great extent of the ground around the city, still unbuilt on, the number of empty stores, the acknowledged overdoing of commercial business, above all, the comparatively slow rate at which the population of the state and the city is increasing in the uh, that is during the depression of the 1850s, it appears to be highly probable that many years will pass before the recent high prices will again be witnessed. That's somebody writing in the 1850s. Most likely, the present reduced prices for all kinds of real estate, but more particularly unimproved lots, will continue for some months to fall lower. When the population of the state, by consequence, that of its great port, are materially increased, prices of real estate in San Francisco may be expected to rise far above the present, even the recent high prices. All right, so as happened previously in Texas, the Mexican government and its appointees were very liberal in California, giving away the public domain. It's estimated that prior to the American conquest, there were about 800 grants to individuals. These comprised a total of 8,000 acres, 8 million acres, and embraced more than 1/4 of the cultivable area of the whole state. So, what a grand opportunity for land jobbers to acquire these grants from the reputed holders and resell at a profit. So, many of these grants were of a conditional nature, and legal titles in most instances were doubtful. So, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that was the treaty between the United States and Mexico that ended the war in 1848. This treaty provided that in the ceded territories, the territories ceded to the United States, all prior property rights should be upheld. But the problem rose as to how these rights were to be determined. As in Louisiana, a half century previously, Congress appointed a commission to investigate land titles. Owners of grants were called upon to prove their titles, but many of them could not do that. They received no deeds or patents. Verbal gifts by governors, prefects, and other officials had been quite common. So that was a wonderful harvest of land for lawyers, speculators, and politicians. The usual fee for securing to the occupant a title was half the land. Well, with a bill of extras, the attorney might easily swap the other half. Right. So Henry George describes this also in his book Our Land and Land Policy uh, of uh, of the Americans, you know, taking land from the old Mexican ranchers by fraud. So he was not much of a lawyer in those days who had not a Mexican grant in his pocket, the title to which his client had paid for. So a lot of the land went to the lawyers. In order to simplify the problem of quieting the titles of Pueblo and mission lands at the Mexican grants, the archives of the villages, towns, and missions were ordered sent to the United States Surveyor General's office in San Francisco, and the land papers were retained there. So, 300 bulky volumes which resulted from this gleaning and collating are an indication of the enormous task undertaken in validating California land titles. There were many instances of gross fraud and deceit in the prosecution of the rights of the alleged owners. A group of Philadelphia speculators are reported to have established headquarters in San Francisco for the purpose of gambling in the Mexican land grant claims. Local politicians and financiers also attempted to increase their wealth by buying rights to grants or backing up claimants. So, as a result of all this, California has more large landed estates than any other states. 310 landed proprietors owned over 4 million acres, capable of intense cultivation and of supporting a dense population. One firm owns nearly a million acres. One railroad owns 500,000 acres. The railroads had gotten huge land grants from the federal government. So they owned a lot of land, including Southern Pacific in California. In Kern County, four companies own over a million acres. That's in the lower Central Valley, or more than half the land held in private ownership. The Kern County Land Company alone owns over 350,000 acres. Uh, So we have at one end of the social scale a few rich men who, as a rule, do not live on their estates, and on the other end, either a body of shifting laborers or farm tenantry. All right, so the railroads uh, will buy the lands on long time, backed by the notes of good men, and then mortgage them for money enough to get the road well on. Then we'll get the towns on the line to issue their bonds for stock. Mark Twain and Charles Warner wrote a book called The Gilded Age, right? Uh, they discussed what was happening with the land. And then they're quoting somebody who says, we can then sell the rest of the stock on the prospect of the business of the road and sell the lands at a big advance on the strength of the road. So that's the book, The Gilded Age by Mark Twain and Charles Warner. So railroads and land speculation. Note that Mr. Bigler's mind was on the rising real estate values. That's the person quoted previously. On the strength of the road, he argued there would be a big advance. Land speculation was the lure of the railroad promoters. Land speculation and railroad construction went hand in hand, just like with the canals previously. During the fever of violent speculation which characterized the period of rapid Western settlement from 1820 to 1837, it was frequently suggested and even importuned that internal improvements be fostered by free gifts of public land. There was a craze for canals and turnpikes and bridges and railroads. The turnpikes were plank roads built with wooden planks. A lot of these were built by the cities. Often they were built privately by landowners who would then profit from the increase in commerce. So the land jobbers wanted these to enhance the value of their properties. The promoters of the improvements wanted to land to reap the profit, which they felt might not result from public utilities they were creating. Thus, land was the bait, land was the quarry. Railroads came later in the 1800s, but the railroad race soon took precedence over the canal craze. As already noted, real estate development and land booming went hand in hand with railroad construction. Rail highways were promoted in many areas, not with the main idea of profiting from their operation, but to increase town and rural land values. Large landowners were therefore concerned in early railroad projects. So the railroad operation in sparsely settled western lands in the West, the railroad operation itself was not profitable. It was different from the transportation situation in the East. Their population centers were already sufficiently large um, and prosperous to furnish traffic immediately. But in the new states, rail traffic must be developed. Under the circumstances, prospects of dividends on capital invested in the Western railroads were remote. Now, let me stop the share and go to the gallery view. And I think there's some chat stuffs. chats. Let's see. So golden years, gold rush, but not his older years. And from Marty Rowland, anyone interested in getting documents, links to video, etc., relative to my course that becomes 310, that begins 310. Okay. Uh, and Growth and Anarchy. Okay. A book, I guess. Okay. That finishes the chat. I'll now go back to share screen. All right. So, yeah. All right, so the railroads, to promote Western settlement and pay off political debts, the railroads were proffered land amounting in extent, in some cases, to empires or principalities as a reward or bait for their construction. The railroads would have been built eventually without all these subsidies, right? But the land subsidies promoted the more rapid development of the railroads, particularly the transcontinental railroad linking San Francisco to the east. So, on the whole, prospective profits of operating railroads in most sections of the country had little influence in inducing capital investment in these enterprises. The opportunities for making money in land speculation, in townside projects, in construction contracts, and other schemes were more generally the lure. That is, speculation was the lure more than operating legitimate transportation facilities. So the first plan of this transcontinental railroad to be supported by a land grant was proposed in 1843, but it was not until the secession of the southern states in the 1860s that the opportunity was afforded to agree upon the proposed route. But even prior to the Civil War, land speculators gambled on the anticipated route. Prospectors went west to search out probable terminals and town sites along the line. Others kept their ears to the doors of Congress to get the earliest news of the location of the lines. Congressmen themselves became financially interested in what was likely to happen. So this is rent taking. The rent seeking is seeking rents as money you don't have to pay for, and rent taking is taking those rents. So the railroad was to have a free right of way over the government domain, and in addition, was to be given 10 miles on each side in alternate sections. So this made an aggregate acreage of about 12 million acres, a vast inland empire, the likes of which had never been known before to be held in single private ownership. But this was not all. The government was to furnish a construction loan in 6%, 30-year bonds uh, at a rate of 16,000 miles per line of road through the prairies, 48,000 over the Rockies, and 32,000 per mile between the Rockies and the Sierras, not to exceed $50 million. And they also got timberland besides that. So it was not the vast stretches of vacant wildlands that attracted speculators. Mere acreage is not what the railroad promoters most desired. It was the favored town sites, the terminals, the way stations that were the chief objects of pecuniary exploitation. So town jobbing and town site planning begun even before the work of actual railroad construction. So as soon as the location of the railroad line was determined, a town would be plotted, streets laid out, and named for the heroes of the Civil War, with lots put on sale. The same may be said of the places along the Central Pacific in California, which, like the Union Pacific Railroad, received a similar grant of land of construction. The Southern Pacific Railroad also came in for handsome land bounding, and its promoters became deeply concerned with town site terminal land jobbing. So the lure land was the lure for undertaking the construction by private enterprise, and it was the bait that led many capitalists to subscribe to the project. All right, I'll stop there and stop share. We're back. Anybody have any comments, questions? Okay, there's a chat. What universities were funded by the fortunes made? Um, I don't know exactly which universities. Of course, Stanford was a university in California, south of San Francisco. There were a lot of universities or colleges funded by special grants. There were land grants to colleges during started during the Civil War. A lot of and Henry George describes these in his book Our Land and Land Policy. But as to railroads funded by as to colleges funded by railroad fortunes, I don't know which ones. Okay, let me go to another. I had some slides that I was going to do also. 60. All right, let me go to share screen. So this is on California real estate. And California real estate is among the least affordable in the United States. There was an article in the New York Times. And in 2005, the least affordable place to live, this is on California housing, there was a study done of the least affordable places, and it was not San Francisco as you might think. Right, the least affordable place to live in the country to live in, measured by the percentage of income devoted to mortgage payments. It was not San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York. Where do you think it was? It was Salinas, California, a small city to the east of Monterey, about 120 miles south of San Francisco. Second was the Santa Cruz, Watsonville areas of California, near Salinas. And the third was Santa Rosa, Petaluma area, which is north of San Francisco. And so California has this distinction of having the 11 least affordable metropolitan areas in the country. So why is land so unaffordable, especially in California? Well, there's a high demand to live here because of the weather, because of the beauty of California. It has beaches and mountains and good weather, right? But why are places like Salinas, surrounded by agriculture, topping places like Honolulu and Miami on the out of reach list? What do you think? Well, one of the reasons real estate is so expensive in California and land values are so high is because of constraints on building, on construction. Demographers and public planners who study such trends say that a confluence of factors in California, both artificial and natural, combine to create a particularly acute problem. Dowell Myers, professor of policy at the University of Southern California says California has both political and geographical constraints on building. That drives up prices and then it snowballs. Let me, I see there's some chats, so let me stop share and go to, oh, we're back in the gallery and there's chat comments. Stanford, yes, Stanford, its comment, Stanford leases residential land to its faculty members. Stanford, the University of Stanford owns a lot of land in the Palo Alto area, and some of that land has split ownership between the building and the land. Stanford owns the land, and another owner owns the building. Uh, so they lease residential land to its faculty members and also other leaseholds that they have. I don't know when that started. Uh, Probably, in the late 1800s. Uh, Another comment, uh, President Jackson felt hopeful of changing the way things were done by there's more of us than them. Well, of course, that did not stop the boom and bust cycle. He did get the United States to end the Bank of the United States, but I don't think that made much difference. California cities have the highest in land share of real estate value in the U.S. That's right. It's the land value that is uh, absorbs the increase in property value because the buildings generally sell for the cost of their reproduction. The ratio in California, well, it depends on where you go. I don't know the average ratio of land to building. Uh, in San Francisco, though, it's something like 80% land value, 20% building value. Uh, no metro was below 62% below the 2008 crash. Some as high as 90%. Yes, San Francisco, for example. Uh, what's the equivalent of railroads back in the 1800s for land speculation today? The generally the provision of public goods by government, where government has grown tremendously in the 20th century into the 21st century. And so there's trillions of dollars spent for public goods and welfare. And a lot of that generates higher rents and land values. So now in the 1920s, the big infrastructure project was building streets because the automobile had just gotten started and the cities were building lots of streets. Uh, and let's see. So then you had the depression of the 30s and then the war of the 1840s, 1940s. Um, there's, yeah, I don't think there's a, well, then there was the internet and so on, but there's no major infrastructure project like there were with the railroads in the 1800s. Seems like from James Shirk, it seems like homeowners, at least in California, are speculators, yes, and profiteers, and would not be inclined to support changes to the single tax, even if financially and morally it were better. Yes, California passed Proposition 13 in 1978, which cut the property tax to 1% of land value, with the property value not increasing by more than 2% a year, regardless of actual market value. And so that was the homeowners voting that in. Uh, and then recently, now if you moved out of your house into another house within California, then the property value would start again at 1% of property value. But Californians voted a proposition in the last election that if you move to another county within California, you keep your tax advantage, right? So it's gotten even more lopsided, where people who are in their homes for a long time have a much lower tax than people who bought real estate recently and pay the 1% of property value, even though that's fairly low relatively. So more messages. Um, I wouldn't give up all hope, though. I think there are ways to, because uh, after Proposition 13 was passed, the states and local governments passed laws to circumvent Proposition 13 with things like parcel taxes. So Prop 13 prevents ad valorem property taxes beyond the 1%, but allows other kinds of taxes related to property. So many localities have enacted parcel taxes, not based on the value, but on the square footage of the property or equal payments by property owners. And there's other types of property related fees or taxes that have been enacted. And so much of the gain to the property owners was eroded through subsequent legislation, although property taxes are still low in California compared to other states. But I think a reform that that cut other taxes and shifted the tax to land value, that reduced taxes on buildings, I don't think it'd be out of the question. They just haven't been given that as a ballot measure. Prop 13 can't collect the rent. Well, yes, now with the depressed economy of the past year, with the shutdowns, a lot of people are not able to pay rent or mortgages. Uh, so, and also there's an eviction moratorium, but we'll see what happens at the end of the year when more people are vaccinated. Going back to the railroads, what are the modern day railroad effect on real estate? Oil gas pipelines be compared to railroads, for example. Uh, at the terminals where the oil ends up, I think there you can see an increase in land value. But along the pipe, I don't, there's no real benefit. In fact, there's a disadvantage because these pipes can leak and cause environmental damage, or they can break. Uh, yes, the electrical grid, but that was, we've had the electrical grid since for the past 130 years. And so, yeah, that is part of the infrastructure. Without electricity, property values would plunge. All right, more messages. Attorneys had a big business the last few months in helping heirs to homes find ways around paying market value property taxes expired in February. Yeah. Just like with the California gold rush, attorneys will profit from it. With the electrification of vehicles or improvements of access to internet in rural locations, yes, as there's better internet, property values should rise because land becomes more attractive when you have the internet with it. Although there's internet in rural areas too. For example, in the Santa Cruz Mountains, you can get internet by satellite. But with better electrification of vehicles and places where you can recharge your cars, well, I don't know if it'll increase land values if gasoline powered cars are declining in number while electric cars are increasing. But yeah, better infrastructure for electric cars would certainly increase land rents. California's public education system went downhill after Prop 13. That's true. It did cut taxes, although if you look at current taxes, with the state has an income and sales taxes that are relatively high. So it's not like there's not enough money coming in. But yes, the public education went downhill, partly because of less funding, but other reasons also. Eisenhower's interstate highways was like the railroads. Yes, that's a good example. The interstate system built during the 1950s definitely raised real estate prices, uh, including in the smaller towns. Yes. And possibly we'll see major infrastructure projects in the coming couple of years. When government gave out land, it was required that one section of each township be reserved for a college. I'm trying to scroll down. I think that's the bottom of that. Okay, Raja Vase. In terms of, whoop, let me go up here. I'm having a hard time getting scrolling up here. Okay, California's public education system. When the government gave out land, it was, oh, that's a college, right? Okay. In terms of problems of land speculation, public goods, and rising land costs, couldn't this sort of land cycle still be conceivably triggered from rises in land value from other factors like private activities? Yes, that's right. So when the economy recovers from a depression, private activities, right, are adding to the demand for real estate. Um, but the reason it becomes excessive is because the initial increase in land value is fueled by cheap credit. Every major cycle has been boosted by low interest rates, cheap credit in the past century due to the central bank. Before that, uh, uh, state and wildcat banks. But anyway, yes, um, private activities help, but the distortion does not come from private activities, but with artificially cheap credit and the subsidy to land values generated by government's public goods, and that then triggers land speculation. So it's a land speculation which eventually gets choked off from high interest rates and high prices. Yes, the school grants, yes, that they funded the local schools. That makes sense. Is that it? Is there a way out of cheap credit? It seems like higher interest rates will trigger a huge withdrawal or recession. Yes, well, it's why interest rates are higher. If uh, uh, the cheap credit was caused by monetary policy by the Federal Reserve increasing the money supply and targeting lower interest rates by manipulating bank reserves. Uh, so the way out of the cheap credit that's caused by the central bank is to let the interest rate be determined by uh, the the private market. Let supply and demand for loanable funds set the interest rates instead of being manipulated by the money creation of the central bank. So that's the way out of cheap credit. And then the higher interest rates, there's two reasons why interest rates go up. One is greater demand to borrow, And if the economy is booming, that greater demand to borrow is not a cause of any problem. The higher interest rates then induce people to save more money to supply more funds to loanable funds to borrowers. The other reason why interest rates rise is because the central bank stops increasing the money supply so much and and therefore artificially causes interest rates to go back up. So the central bank first provides cheap credit, and then to prevent too much inflation, tightens up and raises the interest rate. So the way out is to eliminate the role of the central bank and have interest rates set by the natural rate of the market, and then interest rates become a normal rate like 3 or 4 or 5%. Dual interest rates for the borrowers and one for the savers. Well, of course, borrowers pay more than savers receive because of the bank overhead and profit, right? The bank is the intermediary between borrower and lender, and so the bank takes some of the interest paid by the borrower. It's not really interest; it's a debt service for the loan. But otherwise, uh, besides that normal wedge between borrower and saver, I don't think there should be an artificially increased wedge. See any more? I think that's the bottom for that chat. Now let me then, since the chats are finished and questions are done, let me go back to what I was looking at before. I was looking at California. So if I go to the, where was it? Um, Here, share screen. All right, so you should now be back on and share screening constraints on building. So there's another reason why prices for real estate are high in California and a few other places, and that is because of constraints on buildings. Um, Now, California has some geographical constraints, but they're mostly political. They're mostly legal. Let me. All right. So the geographical limits of developable land in California are the hills and coast, while the political restrictions are state and local regulations. But the geographical limits should not really prevent higher populations because you can build up in the areas where you have homes. So preventing building new homes in response to both environmental and congestion concerns. While many states have regulations on growth, California is a leader. Over the past decade, more people have left California, emigrating to neighboring states and further away to Texas and Florida than have moved in from other parts of the country. So California's population increase is driven primarily by births and foreign immigration. Recently, population growth has stopped. In fact, with the recent census, California had been gaining representation in the House of Representatives, but now, with the population growing more rapidly outside of California than in California, we may lose a congressional representative in the next election. So while California's birth rate is not the highest in the nation, Utah's is. It's near the top. California's population grew by 7.3% from 2010 to the end of 2019, only slightly higher than the national rate of 6.3%. International migration to California has remained strong with a net inflow of 1.5 million. But from 2015 to 17, California saw a net loss of between 129,000 and 143,000 residents to domestic migration each year, according to census estimates. So individuals and companies are leaving California. California has lost more people to other states than it has gained for much of the last 2 decades. And here's a graph of California population growth. You can see that the high yearly change that we saw in past years is no longer in effect. In its 2019 population update, the State Department of Finance reported almost 40 million Californians, the smallest increase since 1939. Last year's population growth was down 86,000 and below the 283,000 averaged in the year in the decade. California added residents by a thin 0.35% annual rate. That's 0.35% over the past 12 months, the lowest growth rate in the state records that date to 1900. So why is the population growth cooling? It's the high cost of living, it's taxes, plus the high cost of real estate. The high cost of living has made moves from elsewhere in the United States financially unappealing for many Americans. USA also has become less hospitable to foreigners, trimming the immigration potential. Births are falling as the state ages and child rearing becomes less popular. In the past year, 450,000 new Californians were born, down from 461,000 in 2018 and 491,000 in the past decade. And we're getting older, deaths rose, and there's been domestic outmigration rising to 197,000 more moves versus arrivals in 2018. So that's the biggest net outflow since 2009. Especially wealthy Californians are leaving because we have a very high income tax rate. For the wealthy, very high graduated income tax rate. So we're driving the wealthy people out of California. So of course, if we tax land value, right, then they wouldn't leave. But if we tax their other wealth, they leave because they can take it with them. So the high cost of So there's a number of reasons for the restraints on home building. The permit prices, the permit process in California is more complex and drawn out now than it was a few decades ago. And the permit process, you need a permit to build, and that can sometimes take years to get. Chief economist for the Realtors Group said the state needs 250,000 units a year to meet housing demand, and we've been below that for the past 10 years. The high demand and low supply created a perfect breeding ground for investors and speculators, which became the last straw in driving houses prices up, said the chief economist for the National Association of Home Builders. And then another quintessentially California issue is Proposition 13, which I mentioned, which slashed property taxes by more than 50%. The measure, which was supposed to facilitate home buying, has backfired. Local governments don't want residential real estate. They prefer retail real estate because that generates sales taxes. So Prop 13 is a big stop sign saying no housing needed, says a professor of public policy at Occidental College. Every municipality is engaged in a bidding war for retail. They're battling for Walmart to keep the libraries open, Walmart as well as automobile shops, because the sales tax obtains a lot of money for automobile sales. You sell a car for $30,000 and you get a 10% sales tax. That's a lot of money. But I mentioned Salinas as being the highest cost area. Prices are up also away from the coast. It's no surprise that house prices have gone through the roof in places like Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco. What is more unexpected is that the less popular areas away from the coast are also topping the list of least affordable places to live. There's a huge movement away from LA County and from San Francisco, and the great beneficiary is the Inland Empire, which is an area in Southern California, and in Sacramento and points east in Northern California, says a demographer at the Brookings Institution. So the very high prices in the coastal cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and so on, right? They're driving people not just out of state, but also toward the eastern and central part of the state. So the migration is happening both among high skilled and middle class residents as well as the low skilled and lower class people. So the cost of housing is exploding even in areas of the state that most people do not think of as traditionally expensive. Baby boomers are getting older and moving into a higher income bracket and into the top dollar markets. Immigrants have high ownership rates at the bottom of the market. So it's a recipe for a bubble. So these non-coastal communities are no longer simply attached to established cities, but in many cases have become job centers in their own right. Jobs follow housing. The Inland Empire, made up of Riverside and San Bernardino counties, have been in a 30-year transition from bedroom suburbs to a metropolitan area in their own right. Now, the San Joaquin Valley in Central California, more rural and more with fur farms, still has a way to go to attract an educated workforce and create a diverse economy. But it appears to be following in the footsteps of the Inland Empire. Jobs follow housing. So they buy when houses are rising. The final paradox in this state of paradoxes is that traditionally many Californians are not homeowners. The state ranks 48th behind New York and Hawaii in terms of home ownership and about 10% below the national average. But over the past several years, as housing prices have increased, even more people are buying. People buy when the market is going up. So more income is going to housing. And instead of fixed 30-year mortgages, people are taking variable rate interest only loans with lower monthly payments. In many cases, homeowners are paying more on mortgages than the 30% of income recommended by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. 40% of all households in California exceeded the recommended threshold. In some cases, are paying more than half their income for housing. And finally, on the politics of housing, new homeowners are buying smaller homes or condominiums. Only 15% of long-term homeowners in California live in multifamily housing units like condominiums, whilst 26% of recent buyers do so. So we won't see the political will to solve the housing crisis until the organized business community weighs in and says it's unacceptable. Yes, Mace Gaffney spoke of land that shouldn't be built on, largely a California reference. That's right. Any other comments? All right, I think we'll leave it at that.